By the time Severus Snape came up the wet drive to Hogwarts, the last of the daylight had gone to iron and the castle had assumed the look of a place preparing to outlive a siege. The boars at the gates steamed in the cold. Defensive charms moved through the air like threads in a loom, colorless, except when lightning touched them and made them shine for an instant over the turrets and battlements. Somewhere out over the Black Lake, thunder rolled low and unhurried, as though the sky itself had grown tired of violence and meant to perform it by habit. He had been a master at Hogwarts for 8 days. The hem of his teaching robe still carried the sharp smell of new dye. Horace Slughorn had retired in nervous haste, full of talk about his health and his rheumatism and the inconvenience of wartime shortages, but Snape knew cowardice when he saw it. The old man had gone pink and slippery at the mere suggestion that certain former pupils might come calling for favors. Dumbledore had written one measured letter, and Severus had arrived to find himself given dungeons, classes, a key ring of cold iron, and more suspicion than any one man had a right to gather in so short a time. He had expected the summons to the headmaster's office. He had not expected Minerva McGonagall to be there when the gargoyle sprang aside. She stood before the desk with both hands braced against it, as rigid as if she had been carved to keep the books from escaping. Dumbledore was at the window, one hand folded behind his back, watching the storm thread itself over the grounds. The office, for all its familiar oddities, seemed altered. The silver instruments turned too fast. The portraits had given over even the pretense of sleep. Faces in gilt frames peered down with frank alarm and old distaste. On the blotter lay a parchment sealed with the crest of the Board of Governors, and another with the ministry seal pressed so hard into the wax that it looked almost vindictive. Dumbledore turned. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Severus. There is nowhere else in the castle I could reasonably have gone after receiving a note from the headmaster," Snape said. "Interim headmaster," McGonagall said with the kind of precision that could flense skin. He looked at her, then at the parchments. Something cold and quick moved under his ribs. Dumbledore came round the desk and laid one long lined finger on the governor's seal. "This afternoon," he said, "the board invoked an emergency clause in the school charter. The ministry has chosen not to object. I am suspended from the office pending review." The words were so absurd that for a moment they made no shape at all. Snape heard only the rain and the revolving tick of brass. Then sense arrived, and with it the obvious question. On what pretext? McGonagall's mouth thinned. Sheltering Muggle-born families on school grounds without ministry sanction. Refusing resident Auror oversight. Refusing also to allow Dementors within the gates. "Then the pretext," Snape said softly, "is decency. Decency rarely survives translation into ministry procedure," Dumbledore said. Snape let his eyes move once over the office. The portraits were listening so intently that one former headmaster had forgotten to look bored. "And what," he asked, "has this to do with me?" Dumbledore did not answer at once. When he did, his voice was so mild it became, by that fact alone, dangerous. "The governors require an interim appointment. They wished for someone reassuring to the old families, unthreatening to the ministry, and young enough that they may imagine he can be guided." "Manipulated," said McGonagall. Dumbledore inclined his head. "If you prefer." The absurdity struck him then, and this time it bit. He gave a short, joyless laugh. "I am 20 years old." "Yes," said Dumbledore, "which is one of the things they like least about you. And yet Lucius Malfoy proposed your name." The office went so still that even the rain seemed to pause to hear what he would say. Snape stared at Dumbledore. Behind his eyes, memory flared. A candlelit room, a snake-faced master, a prophecy broken in half, Lily's name like a wound reopening. Lucius. Of course. A Slytherin face in the chair. A former Death Eater in waiting. A young man of obvious talent and ambiguous loyalties. The board would tell itself it had compromised. Voldemort would hear it had gained a foothold. The ministry would pretend it had prevented something worse. Minerva made a sound of disgust. It is obscene. It is useful, Dumbledore said, and there was iron in him now, plain at last. If Severus refuses, the board will choose a man they truly own, or a woman. There are no shortages of the willing. If he accepts, Hogwarts remains in hands I trust. You trust strangely, Snape said. I do, Dumbledore agreed, but not carelessly. Snape looked down at the governor's parchment and thought, with savage clarity, of the small cluster of children already sleeping in guarded rooms beyond the hospital wing, because their parents had been burned out of a Birmingham terrace 2 nights earlier. He thought of the letters intercepted by owls, of names whispered in Nocturne Alley, of the way the war was turning hungry eyes toward any place that contained the young. He thought, most unwillingly, of an infant in hiding and a woman with green eyes who had once laughed as though the world were simple. What authority, he asked, within these grounds? Dumbledore said, mine, entirely. The office passes with the chair. And you? I shall be where I must. That, more than anything, told Snape how grave it was. Dumbledore loved Hogwarts with the dangerous tenderness of a man who had once lost a home and meant never to lose another. If he was willing to leave it, then he believed the war had widened beyond any single wall. McGonagall's gaze burned into Snape's profile. She did not plead. She was too proud for pleading and too angry for persuasion. Yet there was, beneath the fury, something like fear. Not of him, not precisely. Of what the school would become in his hands. Of what he would need to seem in order to keep it from being worse. Very well, he said. The words fell like a lock turning. Dumbledore studied him for a moment that felt longer than the storm. Then he nodded once and moved aside from the desk. Snape came forward. The chair behind it was larger than he had imagined from below. Dark wood, worn arms, a back carved with serpents and thorns and old stars. When he set a hand upon it, the grain under his palm was warm. He sat. Around him the portraits stirred. One old witch sniffed. A black-bearded wizard muttered something about boys. Phineas Nigellus Black gave a sharp, interested smile that was almost insult enough to make Snape rise again at once. But the office did not reject him. The instruments settled. The fire bent in the grate. Somewhere deep below stone and staircase and sleeping chamber, the castle acknowledged the transfer in the language of old magic, and the wards altered their key. Dumbledore laid the seal of Hogwarts on the desk before him. Headmaster, he said. Outside, lightning split the sky from end to end. The announcement was made at the opening feast under a ceiling that had chosen not stars, but a moving lid of slate cloud. Students filed into the great hall with the ragged noise of the living trying to sound unafraid. Their chatter dulled when they saw the high table. Dumbledore's chair was occupied. That fact alone would have been enough to silence them. The occupant finished the work. Severus sat in black, narrow and motionless, the candlelight sharpening rather than softening his face. He was too young for the chair. Everyone could see it. Seventh years stared at him with the fascinated contempt of those who had, not long ago, shared corridors with him as an older student. First years looked from him to McGonagall and back again, seeking some correction of reality that did not arrive. Lucius Malfoy stood to make the formal statement, one pale hand resting on the back of the governor's bench, as if the whole arrangement amused him privately. He wore mourning colors so rich, they seemed almost theatrical. The silver head of his cane caught the fire in cold glints. His voice carried perfectly. On behalf of the Board of Governors, and pending the Ministry's review of recent extraordinary circumstances, it is my duty to inform the school that Professor Severus Snape has accepted appointment as interim headmaster of Hogwarts. The words ran out over the tables. At Gryffindor, a cup fell and rang. At Slytherin, several older boys exchanged the sort of smile that imagined itself discreet. Snape saw them and thought, not for the last time, that the war had made idiots bold. Lucius sat. McGonagall did not applaud. Flitwick's hands remained folded, his bright eyes unreadable behind the spectacles. Sprout looked as though she had swallowed soil. Hagrid was not present. He had been off grounds for a week escorting frightened families in from the West Country. Madame Pomfrey stared at her plate as if considering whether she might poison the entire board and call it triage. Snape rose. He did not waste time on gratitude. There was none in him to waste. "Hogwarts," he said, and the hall answered in 1,000 tiny silences, "remains a school. It will continue to do so." He let that settle. It was both promise and threat. From tonight, curfew begins an hour earlier. No student moves after dark without faculty escort. Hogsmeade weekends are suspended until further notice. Owls arriving from outside the grounds will be screened. No dueling outside supervised instruction. No gathering of more than 12 students in any corridor, classroom, tower, or common room after evening meal. A rustle of outrage passed along the benches. He ignored it. Any student found repeating political slogans, blood purity slurs, or threats drawn from events beyond this castle will discover that I have no patience for imported stupidity. That earned him complete silence. He saw, out of the corner of his eye, McGonagall lift her head. "If these rules offend you," Snape said, "be offended quietly." He sat. Food appeared. Hardly anyone touched it. Later, in the corridor outside the hall, Lucius fell into step beside him. The governors had gone. The students were contained in their houses, with the first rumors breeding among them already. "A severe little speech," Lucius murmured. "The board will admire the discipline. The Dark Lord will admire the symbolism." "The board may admire whatever it pleases," Snape said. "The Dark Lord will receive a school intact. I did not agree to turn it into a recruiting pen." Lucius smiled without warmth. "Everything recruits, if one waits long enough." He moved on, leaving a faint scent of expensive smoke. Snape watched his back until it vanished at the turn, then continued to the front steps where McGonagall stood under the arch, looking out at the rain. "You heard him," she said. "I am not deaf. You are making a prison." He came to stand beside her. Across the dark lawns, the ward lines shifted, pale as fish under black water. "Prisons," he said, "at least have walls." She turned then, anger bright and honest in her face. "And what will you be while you keep them behind those walls? Jailer? Savior? Spy?" He looked at her properly for the first time since the office. Minerva McGonagall was a woman who could endure more truth than most men survived. Unfortunately, this was not truth he could give. "Headmaster," he said. That evening, just before midnight, the gate wards flared blue. Students nearest the windows in Ravenclaw Tower saw 3 cloaked figures at the boundary and pressed close to the glass. Word ran through the castle faster than fire. By the time Snape reached the entrance hall, eyes were already peering through arrow slits and between banisters. The visitors wore masks. Rain silvered the beaks and brows. One raised a wand in greeting so insolent it amounted to a challenge. "We have business," a muffled voice called, "with several of the older Slytherins." Snape stopped on the top step, hands empty, robes stirring in the draught. "Then your business is wasted. Not according to the understanding we were given." "Your understanding," Snape said, "was poor." The lead figure advanced 1 pace. The ward at the threshold snapped white. The masked wizard recoiled with a curse, gloves smoking at the fingertips. A ripple went through the watchers hidden in the stone. "This school," Snape said, quiet enough to make them strain to hear, "admits students, staff, ghosts, owls, and those I invite. You are none of those things." "Nui. Nada." For one taut second he thought they might test him. He could feel the castle coiling around the decision. But the figures glanced up at the watching windows, at the bright-lit stair, at the fact of witnesses, and thought better of public defeat. They retreated into rain. Snape stood until they were swallowed by darkness. Then he turned and found half the school staring at him from the stairs. He knew exactly what they would make of it, that he had spoken too coolly to strangers in masks. that they had come to him first. That one does not drive away wolves unless one speaks their language. By dawn, the story had reached every bed in the castle. October taught the castle his tread. November learned his temper. He made Hogwarts difficult to move through and impossible to surprise. Doorways that had once yielded cheerfully to anyone with the right shove or password became exacting. Towers locked themselves against wandering feet. Staircases altered their loyalties after dark. Flitwick spent 3 nights hanging charms so delicate that even he, with all his professional vanity, admitted grudging admiration for 2 of Snape's additions. Sprout converted one greenhouse to a steady crop of ingredients for restorative draughts and blood-replenishing potions. Madame Pomfrey established a second infirmary in a disused classroom behind a portrait passage only the staff and the house elves knew. Children noticed less than they might have, because he was careful where he let them notice. Evacuation drills became, on paper, exercises in fire safety. Defensive practice entered the older years as applied wand discipline. He ordered mixed house study periods for 5th and 7th years, ostensibly to prevent academic decline during wartime disruption, and because a knot of students spread across 4 houses was harder to sort neatly into prey and predator. He tripled the punishment for hexing, doubled it for blood slurs, and made no distinction whatever between his own house and the rest. That, more than any of the rules, shocked the castle. When a Slytherin 6th year called a Ravenclaw 1st year, a mudblood in the dungeon corridor, and lifted his wand as if the word itself were permission. Snape took 20 points from Slytherin before the boy had finished his sneer. Then he stripped him of Hogsmeade privileges he no longer possessed and assigned him 3 weeks of midnight cauldron scrubbing under Filth's direction. The story spread faster than any other. It did not make the younger students love him. Love had never been an on-offer. But fear became more complicated. He remained sharp-tongued, impossible to please, and pitiless about foolishness. He also became, with increasing and unwilling clarity, a wall against which the ugliest things in the world occasionally broke. He used Slytherin for this because Slytherin was what he had. Prefects brought him intercepted notes, whispered names, mentions of brothers, cousins, godfathers, and dinner-table boasts gone suddenly grave. One 7th year, pale with the effort of choosing against her own family, laid a list on his desk and would not meet his eye while he read it. 3 names had already been approached during the summer. 2 more before the start of term. A younger boy had been told that glory came early to those pure enough to seize it. Snape burned the parchment over the candle and sent the girl back to bed with a detention slip to maintain appearances. He learned the shape of terror in children. It was not always tears. Often it was a studied insolence, or overneat homework, or laughter that arrived a beat too late. A muggle-born Hufflepuff who had not heard from her mother in 6 days asked to stay in the library after hours and pretended it was because the herbology text was interesting. A shy Gryffindor 2nd year started carrying his wand in his sleeve and flinched whenever an owl passed overhead. At night, Snape moved through the sleeping castle with the kind of vigilance that became, with repetition, indistinguishable from prayer. He would pause outside dormitory doors and listen to the rise and fall beyond them. A cough, a dream murmur, the scrape of bed hangings. Children, all of them, even the ones already trying to be their fathers. His reports to the board were models of curt institutional dryness. His reports elsewhere were not reports at all, merely requests, inventories, complaints about supply lines, corrections to timetables, harmless things that traveled by channels hidden inside ordinary school business and emerged, in hands cleverer than the governors knew, as intelligence. Sometimes he caught McGonagall watching him when she thought he would not see. She did not apologize for doubting him. He would have despised her if she had. Instead, she gave him facts when he required them, and arguments when he deserved them. They fought about corridor patrols, about staffing, about whether younger students should be told more or less of the truth. He found to his annoyance that he preferred her anger to most people's agreement. By the first frost, Hogwarts had become the safest place in Britain. This did not mean it felt safe. The children still lowered their voices when the wind moved oddly in the eaves. They still counted owls at breakfast and read the staff table with furtive hunger for signs. They still started when the gates flashed after dark. Yet, no one disappeared. No masked figure crossed the threshold. No letters of invitation reached the dormitories unanswered. And when the world outside descended further into blood and smoke, the school held. It held because he was merciless. It held because he lied. It held because every morning he rose more exhausted than the last and put on the black robes as if donning the shape of a man he hated. The smell that brought it back was sour ale on wet wool. One of the governors had called that afternoon. Some aging traditionalist whose principal contribution to the war was complaining that it made silver tarnish too quickly. He had left behind, in Snape's office, the stale fug of the Hog's Head, old beer, damp wood, smoke ground into curtain and sleeve. Snape stood after the man's departure with one hand on the desk and the office around him gone dim, while memory unlatched itself and opened. The room at the inn had been low-ceilinged and ugly. Sybil Trelawney had seemed part of it, all drapery and desperation, smelling faintly of dust and sweet sherry. Dumbledore had gone there to interview her out of politeness more than conviction. Snape had gone there because he had been told to listen. He had waited on the staircase outside the door, one hand on the banister worn greasy by generations of innkeepers and drunkards. Below him, the public room muttered with tankards and bad weather. Above, through the thin plank of the door, drifted a voice so theatrically vague that even now he could recall his contempt. Then it changed. He had felt the change before he had understood it. Something in the air stiffened. The ordinary room on the ordinary landing ceased for a moment to be ordinary at all. Trelawney's voice dropped into a depth that did not belong to her, and the words that issued from it struck through the wood and into him like thrown metal. A child born as July died. A child born to those who had defied the Dark Lord thrice. A child marked by the power to end him. He heard only a fragment. Aberforth dragged him from the stair before more could be said, swearing and half-throttling him in the passage. But the fragment was enough. He tore himself free. He carried what he had heard through rain and filth and fear to the one man in Britain, to whom such words were worth any risk. Voldemort received the prophecy as a starving man receives the scent of bread. He did not speak while Snape repeated it. He stood with his long fingers curved lightly over the carved arm of a chair, his face more still than stone, and when Snape finished there was, for a moment, no sound at all in the room. Then the Dark Lord asked questions. Not about the prophecy itself, he had heard all he needed from that, but about families, dates, allegiances, children born at the turn of the month. It took time for understanding to become terror. Time, and one careless mention in a corridor, and a name repeated by another voice. Potter. Gosh. A boy. Born at the end of July. Lily. The memory of panic still shamed him because panic had been honest. It had stripped him to the single selfish truth beneath every finer word. He had not gone first to save a child or preserve a balance in the world, or repair a monstrous mistake. He had gone because Lily Evans had become mortal, in a way he could not bear. He found Dumbledore in darkness under the school's edge, where the torchlight from the lower windows did not quite reach. The old man listened without interruption while Snape, breathless and fevered with dread, asked for the impossible. "Hide her," Snape had said. Dumbledore's face did not change. Only his eyes did. They went cold enough to hurt. Her alone? The contempt in those two words had been cleaner than any curse. Shame followed panic. Shame, and then a deeper fear still. Snape had swallowed, tasted blood where he had bitten the inside of his cheek raw on the walk, and forced the rest out. "Hide them," he said. "All of them. Him as well. Because you now discover a conscience? Because the Dark Lord means to kill them." Dumbledore had looked at him for a long time. The night moved softly in the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a child in the castle laughed, unaware of anything but the pleasure of being alive. "What will you give?" Dumbledore asked at last. "For their safety." "Everything," thought Snape. "Everything except the one thing that would make the answer clean. Whatever you ask." Dumbledore turned that over. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, but the quiet had judgment in it. Then begin by protecting those whose names you do not know as fiercely as the one whose name you do. The memory ended there, as such memories often did, not with resolution, but with a command he had been obeying ever since. In the present, the office fire had burned lower. The rain had stopped. Snape reached for the stack of discipline reports before him and found, with detached irritation, that his fingers had tightened hard enough around the quill to stain them with ink. He set the reports straight. Outside, the corridor carried the muffled thunder of children changing classes. Whatever else he was, whatever he had done, he had made himself a bargain in the dark and would pay it in daylight until the debt was called closed. Winter came hard and early. The first snow sharpened the towers and deadened the grounds. By December, the war felt less like a storm than a season that had settled in with intent to stay. Funerals multiplied in the prophet. The ministry used ever harsher language and ever more frightened men. Whole villages learned to blow out candles quickly when the dogs barked. At Hogwarts, the windows filmed over with frost, and the children developed the pale, quick-breathing restlessness of creatures held indoors too long. It might have been ordinary school winter, if not for the owls that arrived late and bloodied, and the way even laughter ended with listening. Bellatrix Lestrange chose the coldest morning of the month to arrive. She came at noon under board authorization signed by Lucius, and countersigned by a governor who had either lost his nerve or never possessed one. She brought 2 masked men with her and a smile bright as broken glass. Snow hissed under their boots as they crossed the front court. Students gathered at the upper windows in clusters, white faces floating between stone mullions. Snape met them halfway. Bellatrix looked him up and down with extravagant amusement. "Headmaster," she purred. "I do admire an ambitious boy. I am flattered you traveled in weather fit to kill lesser women." Her laugh rang against the walls. "Still venomous. Good. I had worried the school would soften you. It has improved my standards." She circled him once, black skirts whispering over snow crust, taking in the badge, the keys, the authority that sat on him like a blade somebody else had forged. The masked men stayed a pace behind her, hands near their wands but not on them. Hogwarts was old magic. Even they were not fools enough to forget it. "We should like a word," Bellatrix said, with some of the more promising students. "No." The word struck cleanly enough that one of the masked figures shifted. Bellatrix raised a brow. "No? No. This is a school, not a market. Children are not livestock to be handled by interested parties. And yet some bloodlines require guidance. Then let their parents guide them at Christmas." The smile left her face. What remained was worse. "You grow insolent. I grow busy." For a beat, the air between them thinned to danger. Snow lifted in tiny spirals at the edge of the court. Up above, someone at a window gasped. Then Snape stepped aside with formal politeness. "You are, however, entitled under the governor's writ to inspect what the board style security conditions. I shall escort you." Bellatrix saw the trap and admired it because it was clever. If she refused, she lost face before witnesses. If she accepted, she did so under his terms, through public corridors, in daylight, with portraits and professors and children noting every word. She inclined her head. "Lead on, then." He led them through entrance hall and main stair and lower corridor only, never allowing a turn into a dormitory passage, never more than a few yards from staff or students. He spoke of reinforced wards, curtailed privileges, restricted owl access, all in the dry idiom of administration. Bellatrix, forced into the role of governor's guest, grew visibly less entertained with each lawful sentence. Twice she tried to peel away. Twice he blocked her without so much as touching his wand. While he paraded danger where it could do least harm, danger of another sort moved quietly elsewhere. 2 students whose names had surfaced in intercepted talk had already been transferred from their house tables to the hidden infirmary annex. By evening, under the cover of disciplinary paperwork and a contrived scandal about unauthorized broom use, They would leave the castle with a pair of trusted adults and disappear into relatives so distant the war had not yet learned their address. One was a Hufflepuff fourth year whose father repaired radios in Leeds. The other, a Slytherin girl with a Muggle grandmother and eyes still wide from having understood, at last, why Snape's detentions were so often private. He signed the forms himself. Temporary withdrawal. Family emergency. The children thought he had expelled them. By the time Bellatrix departed, she had collected nothing but frustration and a fine catalogue of Hogwarts plumbing. At the gate she paused, put 2 fingers under Snape's chin in a gesture intimate enough to be obscene, and smiled into his face. "You do this beautifully," she said softly, so that only he could hear. "One day you may even convince yourself." Then she was gone, black against the whitened drive, her companions with her. Above, the watching students burst away from the windows as he turned. They scattered like guilty thoughts. By supper, the tale had grown. Bellatrix had laughed with him. Bellatrix had touched him. Bellatrix had called him friend. No one at the tables knew that 2 children were already miles from the gates because he had allowed the castle to despise him on their behalf. The ministry arrived 3 days later, which proved only that the ministry remained most efficient when offended. Barty Crouch came in person. He disdained ceremony. The first warning Hogwarts had was the crackle of anti-apparition wards protesting forced entry at the boundary, and the sudden march of 7 Aurors up the front steps in dark blue traveling cloaks wet with road slush. Their faces held that particular official severity which is half discipline and half fatigue. Britain was full of it by then. Snape received them in the office under the watch of the portraits, none of whom troubled to hide their interest. Minerva stood by the door with both hands folded. She had asked whether he wanted her present. He had said yes, because there were moments when witnesses were more useful than allies, and she knew how not to speak. Barty Crouch was not old, but war had paired him. His hair was cut too close, his mouth too straight, his eyes ringed with the sleepless bruising of a man whose work followed him into every room. He looked first at Snape, then at the chair, then very briefly at McGonagall, and Snape saw the exact point at which distaste became calculation. "Professor Snape," Barty said. "Intern Headmaster, Mr. Crouch. We have reports of unauthorized visitors on school grounds. You have inaccurate reports." "Do I?" "They were not on the grounds." Barty's jaw flexed once. "We also have reason to believe communication has passed between known Death Eaters and certain students of this school." "We have reason to believe many things," Snape said. "Belief is not evidence." One of the Aurors shifted as if annoyed by language that did not bleed. Barty lifted a hand without looking back and the movement ceased. "We will inspect the dormitories." "No." McGonagall's head turned slightly. It was the first sign she gave of surprise. Barty's gaze hardened. "You mistake your position." "No," Snape said. "I understand it perfectly. You may inspect common corridors, classrooms, owlery, grounds, and outbuildings. You may not enter house dormitories without cause particular enough to survive public explanation when 12-year-olds write to their parents demanding to know why ministry wands were inside their trunks. Nah, they may be consorting with terrorists. They may be children. Children become recruits. Men like you," Snape said, "ensure they do." The office went so still that the fire could be heard shifting in the grate. Barty took 2 slow steps forward until he stood with the desk between them like a treaty line. "You will not lecture me on what war requires." "No," Snape said. "I will merely prevent you from conducting it in my first-year dormitories." Something flared and died in Barty's face. Anger, certainly, but also the exhausted recognition of a man who has heard his own worst thoughts spoken aloud by someone he despises. When he answered, his voice was flatter. "Then we will post Aurors on the grounds." 2, Snape said. "At the gatehouse. No interrogations. No contact with students except in visible emergency." "None. Kadi. You are in no position to bargain." "And yet," said Snape, You have been doing so for the last 5 minutes. The inspections lasted until dusk. Aurors tramped through armories, owl towers, classrooms, disused passages, staff offices, and the outer edge of the forest. They found cursed trinkets confiscated from students, old contraband, a crate of Peruvian darkness powder older than half the staff, and nothing whatever that justified storming the dormitories. Barty left with 2 men at the gatehouse, and a dislike so concentrated it seemed almost clean. After the office had emptied, McGonagall remained. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, they requested permission for Dementors before they came. Snape was taking off his gloves finger by finger. I assumed as much. And you had already prepared your refusal. He looked at her. Yes. She studied him with that severe intelligence that gave away nothing cheaply. There are children in Slytherin, she said at last, whose fathers have killed people I knew. And yet? He asked. And yet, she said, I would not have them questioned under a ministry lamp at midnight either. It was, from Minerva McGonagall, a considerable offering. Snape set the gloves down beside the governor's files. Then we understand one another. Do not overreach yourself, she said at once, as if correcting the balance. I understand only that you did one decent thing. He might have answered. He might have sharpened the moment, spoiled it, retreated into the easier geometry of mutual dislike. Instead, he said only, You may tell Flitwick the gatehouse wards require tuning. The ministry men lean. No, you. Her mouth, against all probability, nearly twitched. When she had gone, he stood alone in the office while the portraits muttered overhead, and the winter light drained blue from the window panes. 2 Aurors on the grounds. Bellatrix turned away. Governors circling. Death Eaters listening. Dumbledore absent. The chair under him felt less like authority than like a wheel one braced against with one's entire body in case the road ahead dropped away. Dumbledore came back to the castle by the route that had once delivered contraband sugar and adolescent lovers. The passage opened behind a tapestry on the 7th floor. Snape heard the soft double tap on the stone after midnight, and dismissed the office door's locking charm with a flick sharp enough to crack the candle flame. Dumbledore entered smelling of snow and cold air, his traveling cloak powdered white to the hem. He looked older than he had 3 months ago. Not frailer. There was still too much force in him for that word, but drawn thinner through the face, as if the work beyond Hogwarts required him to spend parts of himself he had previously kept in reserve. The blue eyes were clear. The hands, when he put them to the fire for a moment, shook once and were still. You have lost weight, Snape said before he could stop himself. Dumbledore gave him the faintest of smiles. Your concern warms me. It was not concern. It was inventory. No, and I. Then the school has made a quartermaster of you. It has made me many disagreeable things. They spoke first of practicalities. Gatehouse wards. Ministry men. A governor whose nephew had lately taken to dining at the wrong sort of house in Wiltshire. One Slytherin 7th year whose conscience had proved less theoretical than expected. 2 younger students safely removed. 3 families admitted briefly to the grounds, and then dispersed under better protection. Facts, all of them. Facts were what allowed both men to remain in the room without drowning in the larger currents beneath. At last, Dumbledore unfolded a map over the desk. Several places in Britain were marked in his hand. Godric's Hollow was not among them. The Potters are moved, he said. Snape's head came up. Where? Somewhere safe. That is not an answer. It is the only one you are receiving. He felt, with irrational force, the old hatred of James Potter rise like a flame blown back to life. It disgusted him even as it came. James had become, in the months since the prophecy, less rival than obstacle. A man whose existence complicated the one salvation Snape had ever wanted, and therefore made him harder, not easier, to think about justly. Who keeps the secret? He asked. Dumbledore folded the map again with deliberate care. That is also not an answer you require. You are trusting the wrong people. Dumbledore's gaze sharpened. And whom would you choose? Myself, Snape said before sense could intervene. Silence answered him. There it was. Naked, ugly, half confession, and half vanity. He expected contempt. Dumbledore did not oblige him. At least, Snape said more tightly, I would choose the school. Bring them here. The wards are stronger than any cottage charm in England. And draw siege to the gates? Dumbledore said. Make every child in this castle a shield around one infant? No. Snape leaned both hands on the desk. They are already in danger. All of them. Yes, Dumbledore said. Which is why I will not increase it. The fire breathed between them. Snow tapped softly at the pane. You think like a fortress now, Dumbledore went on, not unkindly. Necessary, perhaps, but incomplete. A school must be more than a place that survives attack. It must be a place where children can imagine a life after one. Snape said nothing. Dumbledore watched him for a moment, then added, Do not become so skilled at counting bodies spared that you forget to know whose bodies they are. It was too direct to evade. Snape looked away first. Later, after Dumbledore had gone back through the passage, and the tapestry had settled as if no one had ever breathed behind it, Snape took a lantern and walked the castle. He went to Gryffindor Tower, where snores rose from behind the portrait hole like some unlovely domestic beast. He passed Hufflepuff, warm and close-walled near the kitchens. Ravenclaw's stair smelled of parchment and cold moonlight. In the dungeons, Slytherin slept under the lake's dark pressure, green-lit and restless. Outside one dormitory door he stopped and listened to a child crying in sleep. Not loudly, just once, sharply, as if from a dream of falling. He stayed until the sound gentled. Then he moved on, silently naming them to himself as Dumbledore had forced him to do. House, year, temperament, vulnerabilities, strengths. The lonely ones, the loud ones, the ones already learning too early how much of themselves to conceal. When at last he returned to the office, the candles were guttering low and dawn not far off. He stood at the window with the lantern hanging dead in his hand and looked down over the blank whiteness of the grounds. Somewhere beyond all that dark, a child marked by half a prophecy slept in hiding under the same winter sky. By the time the next autumn came, Hogwarts had settled into its fear so completely that the fear itself began to resemble routine. First years arrived with trunks and owls, and the stubborn assumption of the very young that adults, however odd, possessed answers. Older students arrived leaner, sharper, with absences at their elbows where friends, cousins, siblings, rivals should have been. The names read at the welcoming feast belonged increasingly to children who had watched funerals that summer, or heard Rose whispered through half-shut kitchen doors, or learned to tell by the set of their parents' mouths when news in the Prophet was being lied about. Snape had been headmaster a year. The office no longer felt borrowed. That was perhaps the most disturbing thing. He could move within it now without the sense of trespass that had marked the first months. The portraits still judged him, but they judged him as a fact rather than an intrusion. The wards answered his touch. The school brought him its troubles as if he had always been the shape set here to receive them. He hated how naturally he had learned the weight of it. Outside the castle, the war had become feverish. Summons came more often to those bearing the dark mark. Names disappeared from professional circles and resurfaced in whispered lists of the dead. Whole streets in London were found ruined by mourning, yet somehow no Muggle paper ever carried the truth. Every side had become better at concealment and worse at mercy. It was during the second week of term that Lucius, pausing after a governor's supper held for appearances, let one sentence fall with a carelessness too deliberate to be accidental. "The Dark Lord," he said, smoothing one white cuff, "is near the end of a particular uncertainty." Snape kept his face still. How fortunate for him. Lucius looked at him sidelong. Fortunate for history, perhaps. No name. None was needed. After he had gone, Snape stood alone in the corridor outside the great hall and felt the blood move coldly through him. There had always been 2 children in danger, not one. He knew that. Dumbledore knew it. Voldemort's pride, however, preferred singular destinies. A choice would flatter him. Therefore, a choice had likely been made. When Snape sent for Dumbledore, the reply returned by indirect means, and in a hand too calm to tolerate. The Potters were hidden. The protections held. No further useful action could be taken by panic. Panic did not ask permission. He found it in himself at odd moments. In the pause before opening an intercepted letter. In the sight of a red-headed second year hurrying across the courtyard. In the way carved pumpkins in the hall looked, if seen from a certain angle, grotesquely like severed heads set to grin. The children sensed his temper tightening and made the mistake of interpreting it as arbitrary. One evening in late October, 2 Slytherin boys in their 6th year cornered a Muggle-born girl outside the library and informed her, with the rich confidence of the cruel, that people like her ought to begin learning to live very quietly while they still had the chance. Snape turned the corner in time to hear the last sentence. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The corridor itself seemed to flinch when he began. By the time he finished, the boys were white to the lips and one of them had lost all house privileges for a month, an honor so public and humiliating that half of Slytherin mutinied in whispers before bedtime. The girl, stunned, muttered her thanks. Snape told her to save gratitude for occasions where it served a purpose and sent her to supper. From the far end of the corridor, McGonagall watched him with the expression of someone revising an equation she still disliked. Halloween arrived with a bright, brittle cold. The hall filled with candles and drifting bats. The younger students made paper masks and charms. The older ones pretended not to notice the way every adult at the staff table seemed to listen between words for something else. Snape tasted nothing on his plate. He watched orange candlelight ripple over rows of young faces, and thought of an unseen cottage somewhere under wards he had not cast, protecting a child he had doomed and then tried too late to save. The feast went on around him in bursts of ordinary sound. Knives on platters. Laughter too loud at one table. Nearly tears at another when a joke landed against grief. Halloween at a school. The sort of evening that ought to have belonged to harmless absurdity. Then, beneath his left sleeve, the dark mark began to burn. The pain struck like metal driven through his forearm. Snape went rigid in the chair. Conversation at the staff table blurred and warped. For one instant the hall seemed to tip, all the candles smearing gold in his sight. He had known the mark to summon, threaten, punish, remind. This was different. This was urgency sharpened almost to triumph. Voldemort was moving. He was on his feet before anyone could ask why. McGonagall half rose. Flitwick's hand twitched toward his wand. Snape did not stop. "Seal the grounds," he snapped to no one and everyone. "No student leaves their house." The mark burned hotter as he strode from the hall, through the entrance doors, down the front steps into the cutting dark. Wind hit him full in the face. The wards parted at his touch. He crossed the boundary at a near run, and the pain vanished. Not lessened. Not eased. Vanished. Where the mark had been fire, there was suddenly a dead and terrible cold, as though something immense and vicious had been cut from the world at a stroke, and left emptiness where command had once lived. He stopped in the lane beyond the gates, breath smoking. For one impossible second he could not think. Then thinking returned all at once, and with its certainty so brutal, it nearly doubled him. No summons ended like that unless the summoner was gone. He apparated. The lane at Godric's Hollow was dark and wet, hedges shivering under the wind. A Muggle church bell tolled the quarter hour somewhere near, absurd and ordinary. Snape came out of apparition half in a ditch and splashed through mud toward the ruin at the end of the row. The cottage had opened like a body under a curse. One wall was blown outward. The roof sagged. Smoke and plaster dust drifted together in the rain. A child was crying inside, not with pain but with the outraged, exhausted fury of still being alive. He knew before he entered. Some part of him had known from the instant the mark went cold. Yet knowledge was not sight, and sight was the cruelty. James Potter lay in the hall as if he had been flung there by the force of refusal alone. One hand was empty. His face, in death, had lost the animation that made Snape hate him and become merely young. It shocked him that how quickly rivalry could be stripped to a body cooling on broken boards. Upstairs in the blasted nursery, Lily lay beside the cot. Her hair had come loose. One arm was thrown out, as though in the final movement she had still been trying to reach for the child. Dust silvered her cheek. Her eyes were closed. For several heartbeats the room had no scale. There was only the body on the floor and the animal fact that the world continued around it. Rain tapping through the broken roof, the creak of split timber, the furious crying of the infant in the cot. Snape did not remember crossing the room. One moment he was by the door, the next on his knees beside her. The boards digging through the cloth at his knees. The smell of smoke and milk and crushed plaster filling his lungs until breath became impossible. He put out a hand and stopped short of touching her face. There were griefs so large they made noise impossible. Everything in him contracted around one white point and held. Footsteps sounded below. Fast. More than one person. Dumbledore entered without apparent haste, though only a man who knew him poorly would have missed the violence of the control that held him upright. His eyes went first to Lily, then to the cot, then at last to Snape. The child still cried. Dumbledore crossed to the cot and bent. When he straightened, the infant was in his arms, small and red-faced and alive, with a dark tuft of hair plastered to his head. On the child's brow, visible even in the poor light, a cut had already begun to form a scar. "He lives," Dumbledore said. Snape stared at him. The words meant nothing at first. Then too much. Lives. The mother dead, the father dead, the child alive. The prophecy riven open in a nursery. Voldemort gone by a force he had not believed in enough to understand. How? The sound that came from him scarcely resembled a voice. Dumbledore looked down at the boy in his arms. A protection the Dark Lord never valued. Love, Snape thought with savage incomprehension. Love, that soft, ridiculous thing poets praised and sensible men stepped around. Yet Lily had stood unarmed before the greatest killer in Britain, and the child in the cot had survived him. Hagrid's tread thundered on the stairs a moment later, huge and blunt with grief, sent by Dumbledore or driven by instinct or both. He stopped in the doorway, took in the scene, and his face crumpled. "Oh no," he whispered. The child reached out a small, furious fist and caught in Dumbledore's beard. Time resumed. It did so crudely. Dumbledore handed the boy over to Hagrid with instructions spoken low and rapid. Privet drive. Secrecy. Speed. Hagrid, weeping openly now, tucked Harry into the crook of his arm with enormous gentleness and lumbered back down the shattered stairs. Snape remained where he was. At the threshold, Dumbledore paused. Severus. He looked up. There was no mercy in the old man's face. There was grief and exhaustion, and an understanding too deep to be mistaken for pity. This debt, Dumbledore said quietly, has not ended. It has changed. Snape understood. He hated that he understood. He looked once more at Lily, then away because he could not endure the permanence of it. When the time comes, Dumbledore said, the boy will need protection. The answer cost him the remnants of whatever simpler life he might once have imagined. Yes, he said. After the Dark Lord's fall, Britain did what frightened countries always do. It congratulated itself too early. The Ministry moved fast to claim victory and faster still to simplify its story. Villains were rounded into lists, heroes into anecdotes fit for speeches, the dead into numbers manageable on paper. Houses burned less often. The prophet began printing relief before the smoke had left half the ruins. People who had hidden through terror emerged into daylight speaking as if certainty had been their posture all along. Hogwarts did not recover so theatrically. Schools rarely do. They continue. Children still woke from dreams. Letters still came edged in black. Some students returned after Christmas parentless. Others did not return at all, because orphaned aunties or suspicious uncles preferred a child closer at hand. There were boys in Slytherin whose fathers were suddenly in Azkaban, girls in Gryffindor whose mothers had died opposing them, and all of them had to cross the same courtyards and sit under the same roof, with adolescence continuing to make its absurd demands about homework and jealousy, and who had looked at whom across the hall. 3 days after Halloween, the board begged Dumbledore to resume office immediately. Publicly, their remorse was fulsome. Privately, it was panicked. The compromise that had seemed so manageable before now looked distasteful with the war's tide reversed. Dumbledore declined. He came to the castle in daylight this time, without secret passages or snow on his cloak, and stood in the headmaster's office while the governor's letter lay open on the desk. "You will remain through the school year," he said. Snape looked up sharply. "Why?" "Because continuity matters." "You expect gratitude?" "I expect competence." Snape's mouth thinned. "The board will object." "The board," Dumbledore said, "has forfeited my sympathy for the season." Minerva, who stood by the fire with one hand braced on the mantel, exhaled once through her nose. It might almost have been amusement. They had, since Halloween, reached a species of working peace, founded not on affection, but on the fact that grief had stripped them both of useless postures. "You ask a great deal of the school," she said to Dumbledore. "I ask a great deal of all of you. And of him." She tilted her head slightly towards Snape. Dumbledore looked at Snape then with the grave exactness that always made evasion feel childish. Of him most of all. The year that followed was quieter in the world, and more difficult inside the walls. Without open war beyond the gates, the wounds within became audible. Slytherins with arrested fathers received letters that smelled of prison, damp, and old despair. Muggle-born students discovered that victory did not resurrect anyone. Some of the staff, relieved too suddenly, found themselves collapsing into exhaustion they had delayed for months. Snape presided over detentions for dueling that were not really about dueling, arguments at table that were not really about table manners, tears in corridors from children who had held themselves together for so long that the habit broke only when danger lessened. He was no gentler in peace than in war. Gentleness would have sat falsely on him, and the children, who were keener judges than adults credited, would have scented the lie. But he became more exact. He learned which silences to interrupt and which to leave untouched. He learned how to arrange two students' schedules so they need not pass each other raw with inherited hatred. He learned that some children of Death Eaters needed protection from triumph as urgently as others had once needed protection from terror. At night, he still walked the castle. The habit had outlived necessity, or perhaps necessity had merely changed shape. He moved through corridors washed now in ordinary moonlight, paused outside doors, listened to breathing, checked shutters, checked wards, checked his own increasingly unwilling heart against the fact that the world had not ended where he had once expected it to. Sometimes in the office, the portraits watched him with a curiosity that had grown less hostile. Not approving, he would have mistrusted that, but less eager for his failure. Even Phineas Nigellus seemed to take a dark satisfaction in the continuation of a Slytherin hand on the school's governance, though he would spoil it periodically by speaking. One morning near the end of term, just as dawn laid a pale band of light across the lake, Snape sat alone in the chair and read again the list of students expected the following September. Names, houses guessed or known, family circumstances marked discreetly in the margins. One name was not there and would not be there for many years yet. Harry. He let the parchment lower. The child would come one day. Not as a prophecy, not as a scar in a cot, but as a boy with books under his arm and the impossible inheritance of two people Snape could not disentangle in himself. James in the face, perhaps. Lily in the eyes. A living remainder of everything ruined and everything saved. The thought did not soften him. It cut. Outside, the castle woke by degrees. Somewhere deep below, house elves began breakfast. A stair groaned in its brackets. Far away, a door banged, and a prefect's irritated voice followed. The ordinary noises of a school, brittle and precious. Snape rose and went to the window. The grounds were silver with early frost. Smoke climbed from the chimneys in straight, colorless lines. Beyond the lawn, the lake lay dark as tempered metal, holding the first light without surrendering any of itself. Hogwarts stood around him exactly as it had when he first entered it as a child, and entirely changed by what had passed through it since. He rested one hand against the cold glass. He had not redeemed himself. He knew that with the steadiness of a fact too old for drama. Redemption belonged to cleaner stories than the one he inhabited. What he had instead was duty, and the endurance to keep it. A school to guard. A dead woman's memory like a flame that would not go out. A living boy to protect when the years finally brought him to these doors. Behind him, the office was quiet. Before him, dawn widened over the grounds. When he turned back to the desk, the chair no longer looked too large.